Hi, I'm Steve Plage, and I'll be your host for this evening's program on Voices from the Village. It's no news to any of us in Santa Cruz that Santa Cruz is a wonderful place to connect with nature. But did you know that Santa Cruz County is centrally located within the only biodiversity hotspot in North America, the California Floristic Province? This is a reason to celebrate, but also to take responsibility. Biodiversity is defined as the totality of all living organisms from all ecosystems. California is distinguished nationally in having the largest number of total species at 6,717, and more than 19% of these are found only in California. However, estimates are that 28.5% of all species in California are facing extinction, and the introduction of invasive species, which will be the topic of our conversation tonight, play a major role in the imminent threat to our thriving biodiversity. The United Nations declared 2010 the International Year of Biodiversity. Most people appreciate the beauty of the natural world, but awareness of how serious our biodiversity is threatened and the implications for human well-being are alarmingly low. The benefits humans gain from biodiversity include sources of raw materials, energy security, protection from natural disasters, secure food supply, clean air and water, and sources of medicine. Also, all cultures gain inspiration and attach spiritual value to ecosystems, so any loss strongly influences our social relationships. Every decision we make affects biodiversity and profoundly impacts the quality of our lives. There are numerous organizations in Santa Cruz County promoting environmental education to raise public awareness and celebrating the richness of the biodiversity around us. We are fortunate to have some of those guardians of biodiversity with us tonight. First, let me introduce Dr. Gray Hayes, the Coastal Training Program Coordinator for Elkhorn Slough National Research Reserve. Welcome, Gray.
Thank you.
Nadia Hamey, a registered professional forester. Nadia.
Thank you.
And Ken Moore, founder of the Wildlands Restoration Team. As we usually do here in Voice from the Village, we go out on the street and ask the people of Santa Cruz what they know about biodiversity or one of our biodiverse wetlands and areas. Tonight we're asking them, I think, about the Elkhorn Slough. So let's see what the people of Santa Cruz had to say about that.
This is Voices from the Village. We're in downtown Santa Cruz and we're asking people, what do you know about Elkhorn Slough and the importance of wetlands?
We love the wetlands.
Okay.
We like the birds. We go to Elkhorn Slough and watch the birds and enjoy that's like 1 million birds down there. And so that's quite a bit of fun. So wetlands are important recreational assets.
I know quite a bit about Elkhorn Slough. I used to work with Earth First.
Can you tell us something about the importance of Elkhorn Slough?
Yeah, well, it's the shark mating ground. When I was there, it was for a shark hunt sabotage, and it's happened, I think, every year around July. The bow hunters come in and hunt the mother sharks, which in any other realm of hunting, you know, we don't hunt the mothers. You know, you could be for hunting or against hunting, but I think there's some rationale to, you know, not killing the mothers. But that's what they specifically do. They're, you know, killing the mothers, and I guess, you know, the fathers that are coming to mate.
I know that the wetlands are very important for biodiversity, as there are many different kinds of animal life that is being threatened now with different droughts and the water shortages. And so wetlands are important to keep not only the biodiversity aspect up, but also just keep natural environment ready for everyone to be able to go and experience. You know, I like going out there. So
I know about wetlands for habitat for salmon in Washington. They're being destroyed at an epically quick rate through overuse of resources and dumping, especially in Puget Sound. In the out of Tacoma Harbor, they got a lot of dumping from heavy chemicals. That's about all I know.
Well, I think that nature reserves in general are very important for our environment and for our sustainability for our earth, because we do need a lot of greens and, you know, to live off of for our oxygen and everything. And I think that society in general does, you know, knock down a lot of nature and a lot of wildlife in general, and it affects everyone and everything. So I'm very much for wetlands, because they preserve so much of like our rich natural resources that we need.
I mean, it works as a drainage system. There's all kinds of wildlife that really depend on wetlands. In the past, people had drained wetlands and swamps because they wanted more space. Now they're drying up, and they're really a super important part of our ecosystem. We really should be strengthening them and allowing them. And also, one good thing is they actually take out pollution out of the water. Unfortunately, when we overdo it, then they become toxified. And when that happens, the whole chain of animals from in the brackish water and in in the water there, as well as the coastals, the reeds and the bushes along the rivers, that's all connected, interconnected in our ecology.
That's what people had to say today in Santa Cruz. Back to you in the studio.
So not surprisingly, people in Santa Cruz are very knowledgeable and very well informed about the natural wonders that surround us, our biodiversity, particularly our wetlands. Gray, let's get started with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work at the Elkhorn Slough.
So I work at the Elkhorn Slough Reserve, helping to train people how to take care of the environment. Many people realize that the Elkhorn Slough is a wildlife-rich wetland. And then maybe they don't realize that they're stewards taking care of that wetland. And what we learned from that stewardship, I work to train other people how to do. It's a very exciting place.
Yeah. Nadia, you are a registered professional registered forester, and we were talking earlier about what you had to do in order to get certified to do it. Tell us just a few minutes about that.
All right. I have my license in professional forestry, and in order to attain a license like that, you need 7 years of combined experience in school, studying forest management, and apprenticing under a registered professional forester. So if you attend an accredited forestry program, that can count as 4 years, and you need 3 more years working with a forester to learn the trade and then take an all-day exam.
Well, it sounds like you're certainly experienced. And Ken, of course, you're the founder of the Wildlands Restoration Team. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Well, the Wildlands Restoration Team started when I had a mandate to start removing one invasive species in Santa Cruz County, which is probably the most prevalent one, French broom. And I just started doing it by myself because I didn't think anybody would care to help me, frankly. And the rangers started telling me that all these huge piles I was making out there were being noticed by people, and some of the people said they wanted to know who I was and they wanted to help. Yeah. I was dumbfounded to hear that, but they had me print some cards and they gave them out, and lo and behold, I started having people coming from all over 4 counties to
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And it's interesting, Gray, that you mentioned stewardships of wetlands and Elkhorn Slough. I'm a sanctuary steward with Save Our Shores and have been for some time. And we also are mentored by people who want us to go out and do what we can to help protect the National Marine Sanctuary here. And so similarly, people who are interested in wetlands, interested in, as we'll talk about, invasive species, things like that, they become, through folks like yourself and Nadia and Ken, the stewards themselves of that, of preservation of that. So Ken, the question becomes, what needs protecting?
Right, yeah, many people recognize the value of wetlands. We've talked about that already this evening. Many people recognize redwood ecosystems as needing protecting. My passion is for our local grasslands. Many people refer to those as coastal prairies, because if you say grasslands, you think, well, they're just grass. But really they're prairies, just like the Midwestern tallgrass prairie or the shortgrass prairie that we know are called prairies. And calling them prairies helps to recognize that they're not just grasses. They're wildflowers, they're hawks, they're frogs, salamanders, bulbs, all sorts of amazing biodiversity. So some of the species locally that inhabit these coastal prairies are things like golden eagles. They feed on the ground squirrels in our prairies. We have badgers in our prairies nearby. They almost disappeared, and now they're coming back along the north coast and near Watsonville and those grasslands there. And we have tiny little things like the metallic green Ohlone tiger beetle that just lives in the coastal prairie near Santa Cruz. As with, many people have heard of this, the Santa Cruz tar plant, which just lives in the prairies near Santa Cruz. Right. And the San Francisco popcorn flower that just lives in the prairies near Santa Cruz, and many other species. I could go on all day. but they're wildflower fields. There's tall grasses like at Wilder Ranch. There's big patches of golden wildflowers like at Moore Creek Greenbelt. And then there's these amazing vistas, like if you look across Watsonville into the hills there, you see grasslands. And I just think people appreciate the beauty of grasslands, and many people appreciate the bluebirds and hawks and things, but they don't often realize how important the grasslands really are for wildlife and for our own enjoyment until the grasslands are gone.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the tar plant, because as you know, that was the subject of much controversy here with the Arana Gulch plan and building what they were calling an educational or restorative path through there. And I can recall going to the Board of Supervisors meetings where there was a forensic botanist there that came and talked all about the tar plant and how it migrates and how it can't migrate if you pave over this area and stuff like that. It was fascinating to find, you know, how sensitive those particular plants, that part of our biodiversity is. And when you don't think about that, we're thinking, well, geez, wouldn't it be a great idea to put a path through Arana Gulch so people could, you know, transverse from Brommer to Broadway or something. So that seems like a good idea, but what about, you know, the biodiversity? So it's interesting.
The invasive species that we're going to talk about tonight really use roads and trails to get around, and the invasive species are really the main threat to the Santa Cruz tar plant, and most of our prairies are really, besides paving them over, it's invasive species. Even once the grasslands or these natural habitats are protected in parks, the invasive species will take management, stewardship forever afterwards.
And Nadia, as a forester, what comes to mind when you think about what needs to be protected within forests?
Well, there is a lot of variability in the redwood forest in Santa Cruz County. I find sort of a vegetation transect from the riparian areas up to the ridge tops, and along with the different geology come, you know, different bands of vegetation and plant communities. So the redwood dominated ecosystem has a different plant assemblage than the redwood Douglas fir, than the hardwood, the oak and madrone areas, and on many ridges around the areas where I work, the top elevation of the ridges is northern maritime chaparral or other plant communities, and so that variability is striking. And within those types, there's pockets of really unique habitat, inland marine sand deposits that have some very unique species that are found in Santa Cruz County and nowhere else in the world. Examples of those include Santa Cruz manzanita, Bonnie Doon manzanita, Pajaro manzanita, and many associates with them. And I think that's really special that we have plants that grow here and nowhere else.
Absolutely. And Ken, you work with the wildlands. I love that idea, working in the wildlands. What strikes you as something that really needs to be protected in the wildlands when you're doing your work?
You know, when I get asked this question, I always know the answer that I give isn't going to be popular, but I hate to say it, but I have to tell the truth. They all need protecting. It's the integration of all these different ecosystems that Nadia and Gray have referred to, some of them here, but there are many more. And it's the integration of all of them that creates the strength of biodiversity that makes this planet run. And without any one of them, we're going to be very, very much poorer.
And it's really interesting to me, the kind of synergistic relationship that we all have with the land, and it goes from ancient religions, and we were talking about in the introduction about the spiritual connotation that people give to the land and how important that is, how important it is for our social relationships. You know, that kind of consideration is often not recognized. Let's go on to our second topic now, and this is really what we're talking about in the introduction, is the invasive species. Gray, describe one or two weeds that you think are threatening our local wildlife or plants.
Sure, yeah. So I mentioned my passion is really these grasslands, these coastal prairies. And so really when you walk in these grasslands, mostly what you're stepping on are invasive grasses from the Mediterranean. most of what we look at, those golden fields, are dead, non-native annual grasses. So grasses are a huge problem, and they all started out in our yards. They started out, and they still are invading from our irrigated front lawns out into our grasslands. And so I'm really concerned about those weedy grasses. And I think we need to be keeping our eye on any of those that we might be putting into our lawns and replace lawns for not just the water, but for, you know, the invasive species that come out of our lawns and into our wildlands. Another species that really threatens the coastal prairie is, I know, something that both Nadia and Ken work on, French broom.
Ah, okay.
And this is, I think everybody knows this plant. It's a big yellow shrub that has wonderful smelling flowers. And you can still buy it at all the nurseries and put it in your yard, and it's great because you barely have to take care of it. It takes care of itself, and then it spreads into our wildlands. And it converts our grasslands into shrublands. It converts our redwood forest into shrub understory, you know, when there's light, and it takes over everything. And I'm really concerned not only because it takes out areas that hawks may feed, that the badger may burrow in, but it creates a tremendous fire problem. And because it's a shrub and it grows quickly, it has a lot of biomass that explodes into flames. Some of us remember the Trabing fire near Watsonville several years ago, fueled by eucalyptus and French broom.
Oh my.
And so French broom you'll see often on roadsides because it spreads along the ditches, and where the public works people clean out ditches, it just keeps rolling down the road. And that's where accidents happen. People throw cigarettes out the window, and the broom explodes in flames and spreads up the hillsides and everywhere, not like anything native would do. It's a real problem that way.
That's fascinating. And as we kind of go through our conversation, I will mention to the audience that this is a call-in show, and I'm sure our engineering staff will put up the number on the screen. So if you'd like to call and you have a question for Gray or Nadia or Ken, please call in and ask them. I'm certain they would be delighted to respond in their expertise and experience. So in the forest, Nadia, what is the most threatening, or among the most threatening, 2 or 3 most threatening invasive species?
It's hard for me to pick just a couple. There's so many.
Well, pick several then.
On my
we have time.
On my hit list. One of the number one that comes to mind is Cape ivy. Cape ivy is a climbing vine that thrives in riparian areas, and it can take over the riparian zone, climbing alders and willows and any of the trees on the stream bank, and just smothering them. Those stream bank trees and their leaf fall are really important for the stream system and aquatic health, because it starts kind of the whole process. The grazers and shredders, the little macroinvertebrate insects that are in the stream, eat those leaves, and then the fish prey on those insects. And when Cape ivy gets a stranglehold in the riparian zone, it can really alter the natural processes there that are necessary. And it's really hard to control because it has root systems that dig in, and it breaks when you try to pull it out. So once it's in a watershed, it takes massive effort and actually going down to scorched earth to get it in check. And it is a really long-term endeavor to try to do that. So that's one species. Forget-me-not is another that moves off into the redwood forest. It's very shade tolerant.
Ken nodding his head, forget-me-not, yeah.
It's got little seeds that like to attach to animal fur and pant legs, and it moves around. It has a really short life cycle, so it produces seed very quickly. And I find where it persists, it forms kind of a monoculture, or it covers everything, kind of like Cape ivy, and really reduces the species diversity. Thistles are another one of my least favorites. We have bull thistle and Italian thistle and milk thistle, and not only do they kind of replace native plants, but they're not fun to walk through. They're really spiny and hard to keep a handle on. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. But
it's fascinating to me and illuminating that the three of you were able to see these things on a micro ecosystemic level. You know, looking at it and seeing all these things that are contributing to our macro biodiversity that people just generally would not think about. It would not occur to them, and yet it's so profound, and it has such a dramatic effect on the world that we live in, that it's interesting to kind of get your bird's eye view of that. One thing I wanted to ask is what I mentioned. I was a sanctuary steward for Save Our Shores, and we go out and do the beach cleanups. They always tell us that, I guess that's ice plant that grows up along the beach. They always tell us that, well, don't worry about stepping in the ice plant because it's an invasive species. Is that correct or not?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's one thing they always tell us. So, well, can we go up on that hill? It says ice. Well, of course you can do that because it's an invasive species. So that's interesting. Ken, for you in the wildlands, what kind of invasive species threats are you seeing when you're out there doing your work?
I have a short hit list of 44 species.
Okay, well, we'll go through that from 44 up to 1.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, Nadia and Gray have touched on some of the really scary ones, but there are many, many others. Gosh, again, I hate to rank these in order of importance because of this biodiversity issue. There are some places in Santa Cruz County, as there are anywhere else, which have, we call hot pockets of biodiversity that are on very small pieces of land. One such one is the Zayante Sandhills, where there's probably the largest number of listed species per square foot of land
anywhere in the US.
I can think of.
Yeah.
Interesting. And that is ripe for spending the most amount of time on that land, even if the specific invasives that are there may not be the ones that I would work on somewhere else as first priority.
But Ken, you work on ice plant. Since Steve mentioned ice plant, what do you do with ice plant? I mean, you're concerned with ice plant.
I was working on ice plant
and now I'm concerned with ice plant.
I was working on ice plant until I came to the studio.
Right?
Yeah. No dinner. So ice plant is a really interesting one. It's in a different category from everything else for many, many reasons. One is it grows on the beach, on beach bluffs. And because of that, me running a volunteer program, volunteers love to be on the beach.
Absolutely.
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, of course.
In addition to that, ice plant has played into our hands in another way, in that it's an easy plant to remove. It's very heavy. Its leaves are full of water. So the weight is an issue, but I've come up with techniques for dragging it rather than lifting it. And I find that I can get people of any age to do ice plant work. And in fact, if we can show some of these pictures that I have later in the right order, I'm going to show you some sites where I actually was this is in Pescadero Marsh, and I was working with my volunteers on what we used to call pampas grass, but which is actually jubata grass. We'll talk about that too. But anyway, this woman came up to me with a clipboard, and she said, I run an outdoor school up the canyon here, and we have kids coming to Pescadero Marsh most of the weekdays throughout the year, and 66 at a time, because that's what our bus holds. And she knew who I was. So she said, is there anything you can recommend that, because usually we just talk about nature, and I said, let me take you to some places. So I took her to where the ice plant was in Pescadero Marsh, and I said, why don't you have your kids do this? And she said, you'll need to come up and give a talk to our staff. We have 13 instructors. I said, I'd be happy to. So I went up and gave a talk one afternoon to a staff of 13 people. This was 15 years ago. And on those sites now, you will not find ice plant. And I didn't lift a finger.
Is that right?
Yep.
And
wonderful.
Where that ice plant is now 20, 30 species of beautiful dune plants,
and
native
I've got pictures
plants,
of that.
right?
Yeah.
And so this is what we see when we control Cape ivy or forget-me-nots or French broom or ice plant, is where those things live. nothing, no other native plants live, generally very long. And where you remove them, we suddenly see a profusion of wildflowers and redwood understory herbs or dune plants or these amazing coastal prairie wildflowers. They come back on their own.
Absolutely.
We had, I was looking earlier for a short video perhaps that referenced invasive species, and I did find one that was talking about invasive species in the Channel Islands, just a couple of minutes, so maybe we'll play that and see what our responses are, our reactions are to that.
Sure.
Good.
Another great challenge for recovery and restoration on the islands is the presence of invasive annual grasses. They grow very fast from seeds and pump out seeds every year and then die off. And so when they die off, they leave a lot of dead material lying on the ground. This is also a fairly unusual situation for the native plants, to have a mat, very thick mat of dead material on the ground that their seeds have to contend with. One of the species that is challenged by these grasslands is the island Phacelia. This is a tiny little annual plant that lives out its life cycle entirely in 1 year. One of the biggest challenges that we have in studying these plants is just finding it. Over the last 12 years, we've found maybe between 3 to about 50 plants per football field size plot, which means you walk around very carefully looking. And when we find the plant, we measure it. We take a coordinate with a GPS unit so that we know where that plant was, so we can come back next year and look to see, did its seeds germinate next year? Are there more plants next year? This plant used to grow in a habitat that was what we call lupin scrub. Now where it's growing are in these headlands where the lupin scrub has been eliminated and these invasive grasses have come in. So when this plant comes up from seed, it's suddenly facing a totally different environment than the environment that it is used to, that it evolved in. The seed has to push its way down through a mat of dense litter and push its stem up through a very shady environment where there's grasses overtopping it, and is doing battle against these bigger grasses. The population future does not look good for these plants. And so this is a situation where we need to go in and manipulate the environment somewhat. It's better for this plant for us to work on restoring or recovering that whole lupin scrub system so that it can be there to nourish those plants when they do decide to germinate.
Oh, these folks looks like they're doing some great work out there. You were mentioning restoration, the work they're doing out there. Describe that to us, if you would.
So sometimes we can actually work to remove the invasive species, like hand, and I know we'll talk about that. Sometimes the invasive species, like the grasses they're talking about out on the Channel Islands, really there's no hope of removing them all. And so what we're looking at now is managing for what are called novel ecosystems. And these are new places that the native plants have to get along. And we need to learn how to, through fire, through cattle grazing, through restoration of the elk, through restoration of the badger, use the animals and the tools we have to manage the invasive species so the native species can live alongside of them. So I mentioned the Moore Creek Greenbelt here in Santa Cruz. That's grazed by livestock, but it isn't grazed by livestock just to produce meat. It's grazed by livestock to produce the native species that would otherwise be smothered in the dry, dead, and tall non-native grasses. So this is one tool that we use, is to co-manage this non-native species with the native species alongside of them, where we protect the habitats, the coastal prairies, from livestock grazing, from fire. It's a sea of weeds. I call it a green oil slick. It looks beautifully green, but there's no natives left in it almost ever. And so this is a part of stewardship most people don't recognize. We have tinkered with the earth And now it's our responsibility to continue tinkering so the native species can live alongside the things we've introduced.
And you know, Nadia, as a forester, are you doing some kind of restoration while you were there as well in the forest lands?
Yes, those efforts are kind of site-specific, and it takes a lot of energy and goodwill to actually make a dent. But I've had experience with teams of volunteer stewards, with French broom on forested properties, both hand weeding as well as cutting broom, and I find that herbicide is also a tool in the toolbox that in certain circumstances you know, can be used to great effect. And it's true that if you remove the weeds, usually the natives will come. And so mostly it's a matter of addressing the weeds, and we do things like mowing roadsides, since roads are the conduit, and sometimes a combination of mowing and spraying and really keeping at it. When I advise landowners about the prospects of invasive weed management, it is a long-term endeavor, something that you can't ever really expect to be done with and complete. You just need to keep at it. But diligent effort, especially along those roadways, can help keep the invasives from marching off into the middle of the woods.
And I know in our area, we have this huge, intricate system of fire trails and things like that. And I know people who are interested in the land trust, we were talking a little bit about your work at the land trust earlier. I know that there is a lot of work being done to clear fire trails and to do that kinds of thing. Is that something that is done, you know, not only to open that up, of course, and to help that particular forested area, but is that also done to restore or protect against invasive species when that's done?
Yes, I would say that's a seed bank that, you know, as you keep infrastructure open by not allowing the weeds to encroach and completely choke trails, that helps, you know, limit the production of seed that's happening.
And Ken, you were talking about the ice plant and removing this from the ecosystem to a certain extent. In the wildlands, are you doing restoration as well? You have restoration projects going on, such as what they were talking about here, or anything in that kind of area?
When I started in this field, which we now call habitat restoration, I assumed, much to my ignorance, that a lot of what I would be doing was replanting. That was incorrect. These two have both alluded to that, and yes, it's really habitat restoration, at least in these ecosystems we're talking about now, and most others as well, really is a matter of controlling invasive species. That's the overwhelming need, and that really defines most of what we refer to as habitat restoration.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, we were talking about kind of what we saw as the threats to our biodiversity and the things that we were concentrating on in terms of restoration. Now, what can we do about any of this? So we've kind of highlighted, I think, some of the problems, some of the challenges. How are we addressing that? How are you addressing that as a group or individually?
Sure. Yeah. You know, it sounds like in the video we watched and some of the words we've exchanged tonight, like, yeah, how big is the invasive species problem? It's everywhere, and it will take our stewardship forever. And some people think, you know, that's depressing. Really, this is an opportunity for us, as some of my friends talk about, to become indigenous. We've created a new ecosystems that we live in, and we are becoming indigenous on this landscape again. We were strangers on this land, and now we are learning what it's like to be at home here.
A fascinating concept.
And so I look at this as an opportunity for us to learn how to live in this world. And there's a lot that we can do to maintain the wildlife that we care about in spite of the invasive species. So what can we do?
What can we do?
We can ask every time we buy a plant in a nursery, is this species invasive? Or does this species have a chance of being invasive? I've spent a lot of time in nurseries. I'm a gardener. I've never heard anyone but myself ask that question in nurseries. And if everybody asked that question in nurseries, we would stop introducing new invasive species. We need to stop doing that right now. We're introducing new invasive species every year. Ken sees them, Nadia sees the new things in the forests. We need to stop doing that first so that we can get a handle on this. So asking at nurseries seems to me to be a very important first step. I've got other ideas, but I'm sure these folks have some too.
Nadia, you share some ideas about what can we do about this challenge that faces us?
Sure. Well, I find it very rewarding personally to be really hands-on about it. I do a lot of pulling of weeds with my fingers. And there are a lot of opportunities to join like-minded people doing work like that. It can be a great hobby. And so there's teams of stewardship volunteers with state parks, with land trusts, with a variety of properties, with Ken and his team, and getting together and going out for a day of hard work, hands-on, is very soul satisfying.
Oh, I can imagine.
And revisiting those places and having that personal before and after, I mean, I find it to be like nothing else. I think it's greatly rewarding. And if everybody did that, with their favorite place or around their home, it would go a long way. So I think getting out and addressing the weed problem, with your own bare hands is one great way to go.
And Ken, your thoughts about what we can do about this?
You might imagine I would have some.
Yeah, I would imagine you would.
Yeah, Nadia put it very well. I had my volunteers, just a spur-of-the-moment thought, write a sentence or a paragraph on why they came out with the Wildlands Restoration Team many years ago. And boy, oh boy, did that turn me on my ear. Responses that I never would have thought. I've had, last count, 3,700 and some volunteers over the last 24 years. And I can tell you that many, many people, some of them in their 50s, have changed their professional career, gone back to school, got a degree in something like restoration ecology, and are now doing this kind of work. And I hear from them. They're all over the place now. So it's this pyramid effect, and as Nadia put it very well, the act of being proactive with your own hands in the soil has a power to it that cannot be addressed any other way. It is literally empowering for you, and the work that you do later, when you see the effect it's had on the land, and you come back like I do 10 years later, 20 years later, and you see that this land is healing, and the native repopulation of all that matrix of those species are there on the land now, and the invasive species is either gone or at a bare minimum, that gives you a feeling that you can't buy with money.
And I think, like you were saying, Gray?
Yeah, so I mean, the sites that Ken and Nadia work on, maybe people can't picture these things, but these are areas with French broom or pampas grass or German ivy, Cape ivy, that had very little wildlife value. So a deer going in one of these areas would have nothing to eat. And what they do is transform these things by leading volunteers, by spending private landowners' money, removing these things, is make a grocery store for wildlife. Where there was nothing there before.
Good way to put it.
And so it's not just it is the beauty, it is the integrity of the ecosystems, but it's feeding wildlife. People put out bird feeders to feed birds. This invasive species control is putting out a lot more because it's a self-sustaining grocery store for wildlife. It's important. And also these invasive species that are choking the stream habitat, they're destroying our water systems. The water we drink relies on intact native ecosystems. And if the invasive species take over the San Lorenzo watershed, we'll have a lot less water. We know that. And our streams will become choked with sediment because there's only a few species that hold the hillsides in place instead of hundreds. So this is really important stuff, and I think people need to recognize that invasive species aren't just something that doesn't relate to them. They need to recognize that they depend on native ecosystems without invasive species to drink their water, to breathe their air, to be safe in their homes against wildfire. All of these things are interconnected.
And I think that you make a very important connection between these things. As you know, the sustainability of our local water supply is one of the hot button issues in Santa Cruz. People talking about the desalination plant, whether we need supplemental water supply. The folks I work with, desal alternatives, we believe that there are alternatives to that. One of the alternatives is to restore our watersheds, is to get out and work in the watersheds, because that's how we're going to be able to maintain that flow, into the San Lorenzo River, and so we can use that as part of our, it's 96% surface water here in Santa Cruz. And so we need particularly to be aware of the things that you're talking about and how they connect with that issue. A lot of times, to me, it seems like a lot of the issues are viewed in isolation. You say, well, it's water supply, what's that have to do with invasive species? Right. Well, it's the watershed, what's that have to do with the forests, that kind of thing. And yet they are so connected that I think the more that we make people aware of that, the more we do conversations like this, the more people are going to be able to ponder the fact that, well, what can I do to not just vote up or down on a desalination plant, but to go out to the wildlands or the forest or Elkhorn Slough and say, this is part of the system as well.
Well, and it's interesting because we have Nadia here who works on a lot of private land, stewarding those lands, and Ken who works on a lot of the public lands. So you have stewardship leaders on tonight's show that represent all of the watershed lands in either public or private holdings. And it takes a lot for a private landowner to put the money towards stewarding that watershed. So we need to think about that. How do we give back to the private landowners who are willing to spend time and money controlling invasive species? And then we need to think about how we support state parks and other public land managers in doing that stewardship work as well. I know, Nadia, you controlled blue gum eucalyptus for down in Big Sur recently. Many people don't know that blue gum eucalyptus, every drop of rainfall that falls in a blue gum eucalyptus forest does not enter the stream. It gets evaporated out.
I've learned something
it's
else
a net
tonight.
loss of watershed land. So removing blue gum eucalyptus, which evaporates out all the groundwater that it can, is a very important part of our invasive species control and our conservation of water. Do you want to talk about blue gum eucalyptus control? Was that one of the first big projects in Big Sur doing this?
Yeah, and it's a project near and dear to my heart. It's been so rewarding. We're on year 2 of 5 years of phased eucalyptus removal in a stand that was about 100 years old. Started with 6 trees, and in the last 100 years it had grown to cover 15 acres. It's in Palo Colorado Canyon on property owned by the Big Sur Land Trust, and was a big concern for fire hazard. The Basin Complex fire was very near there, and if this particular patch of eucalyptus were to go up, it would block all the escape routes for Palo Colorado Canyon. And so in the first year, we treated just a couple of acres for thousands of dollars because we wanted to protect the slopes, and so we had sophisticated methods of getting the trees out without scouring the ground. And immediately, and in the year following that first phase of eucalyptus removal, we saw just an amazing influx of the native species come from underneath that eucalyptus duff layer. Wild cucumber and various chamise species, really delights coming forth. Eucalyptus is really hard to control because, like many invasives, it sprouts So it takes diligent effort, but it's a native habitat restoration and a fire hazard reduction project, and it's really a feel-good project.
And I didn't know much about that. In fact, about eucalyptus, and I had read an article in the Good Times, this was maybe a couple of years back, talking about eucalyptus trees and how invasive they are. And I was just astounded, that it was, seemed like a very monumental, kind of a problem. But one of the things that Nadia and I were talking about earlier was her work with Big Tree Lumber. And this is what I found very interesting is the public-private partnership. As you have to have that here in town. I think if you get any challenge that you really need to face and you're able to resolve in any way, you're going to have to have the public involved, and you have to have private involved, private sector. And we were talking about your work with Big Tree, and here you are,
Big Creek Lumber.
Big Creek Lumber, and here you are, as a registered professional forester working for a private company. And I think that, and here's Gray working in Elkhorn Slough, and Ken working with the wildlands. This wonderful, symbiosis, I say, of this public-private partnership and all the information that you share and all the collective efforts that you put in is fascinating. And Ken, do you have anything that you want to share about your work in particular in terms of some of the challenges you're facing now?
Sure, yeah. Eucalyptus is actually a really good segue. I do a lot of work on eucalyptus too, and acacia, which are the two major invasive tree species. Both from Australia. A lot of the really bad invasive species we have here are from Australia because it's a very similar climate to ours. Eucalyptus in particular, of course, was planted here extensively in a mistaken attempt to think that it was a good lumber tree. It doesn't grow that way in the northern hemisphere, but nobody knew that at the time, so they planted just countless thousands of acres of it, and that's why we have such a problem with it now.
All right, yeah.
Now, in addition to that, Eucalyptus globulus, which is the blue gum that we're talking about here, is the most widely planted tree in the world now for deforestation follow-up.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that either, so I'm learning all this today.
Yeah, and it's a huge problem.
And yeah, so we started out this round robin talking about what people can do. And I think it's important, I know Ken and Nadia have both come against this, is people don't know what an impact these invasive species are. So oftentimes when these projects happen close to them, they like the eucalyptus. It was pretty, it smells nice, but they need to realize and accept that these projects are really important for all of us, and support this work, and they can support it by learning about the restoration and perhaps not complaining that it's happening, which is an issue, and they can support the work by showing up and helping the Wildlands Restoration Team or the land trusts doing this work, right? And they could support the work in their own backyards if they live near the country, and not planting the wrong thing or removing the invasive species in their own yard, which makes a huge difference. And they could support this kind of thing by, say, joining the Native Plant Society or the California Invasive Plant Council. There's the one group statewide that's dedicated to researching the best ways of removing invasive species, doing it sensibly, keeping people informed about invasive species. That's the one organization that focuses on that in California.
And I think that really brings the conversation full circle, because I know when I've worked on any particular project, sometimes you're so focused on what you're doing that you're almost working in a vacuum. And what you really need to do is the outreach, is to get people out, get people talking about, shows like this, for instance. Get people talking about it, thinking about it, having your contact information so people can say, that sounded like a terrific thing that I can spend some time. Why don't I contact their web account or their Gmail or something and devote some time, an hour or 2 or 3. And that kind of outreach, I think, and we are such an engaged community. That's the beauty of Santa Cruz County. And I'm glad to hear that we are a biodiversity hotspot, because we're also an engagement hotspot. We're also a place where people really love to live and they love the land. And I think a better understanding of how those two things are collaborating is very important.
How many opportunities do people really have to go and really be a part of restoration? Not that many opportunities to actually learn about the land and what's going on out there, but we mentioned some tonight. And it's difficult otherwise to know where to start.
Right.
And it's not that you have to be, do you have to be really strong to show up and pull weeds? No. You just have to be willing.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Well, and it's interesting, in previous shows we've had that have been more spiritual in nature, we've had people talk about not being on the land, but being of the land. That's right. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. You know, as being part of nature, being a contributing part of nature. We are part of that biodiversity. Right. And unless we really fully immerse ourselves and engage in it, then the biodiversity is just going to suffer just because we haven't done that. You know, I think it's important.
That's right. Many people think, well, we'll recycle. It's important. We'll bike to work. Yeah. That's important. We'll put solar panels on. What these efforts are talking about is taking less. When you're talking about pulling invasive plants, it's talking about giving something back. It's not just taking less, it's giving something back. And there are very few opportunities to make that net positive rather than, oh, just I'll take a little less.
Ken, you're nodding your head. You have some thoughts about that?
Wow, great. It's saying this very well. Yeah. You're stealing all my thunder here.
I'm certain you still got some thunder left here for us.
I might have a couple bolts in my pocket. Yeah, the whole idea of habitat restoration in general, which, as we said, it mostly consists of invasive species control by necessity, is not only helpful to the land, but it actually restores the restorationist.
That's an interesting way to put it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is true in my life. I was extremely frustrated as I'm a landscape architect by profession. Oh, okay. And I'm still ashamed to say this, but I was taught to plant the very species that I'm spending the rest of my life ripping out. So the restoration is occurring for me, you know, every day I'm out there, even though I've been doing this. Well, I started doing this over 55 years ago. So it's powerful.
I'm interested in hearing from Nadia, who works with private landowners, you know, why they do this stewardship.
Yeah, please.
Because you have people that are willing to spend the time and money removing invasive species on large tracts of private land. Why?
Well, I tend to think that there's a little bit of an innate part of human nature that finds the native habitat and biodiversity more aesthetically pleasing, because you kind of see all of that variety versus you know, seeing like the color of periwinkle or vinca, like one leaf color. If you're looking at a place that actually has an assemblage of many native plants.
It's more beautiful.
It's beautiful. I think people like to see that, and many owners of forest land in the Santa Cruz Mountains have that sensibility. So they want to keep their forest intact. I work with, you know, private forest landowners that choose to do selective timber harvesting on their land, and the disturbance along with that can be an invitation for invasives, but they value you know, not letting those invasives take over and ruin the view shed. So I think that that's a big part of it. It's pleasing to the eye.
So with our last couple of minutes, how can people engage on this? How can they contact any or all of you and give some time and some energy and some life back to, you know, the land?
Sure.
Great.
Yeah. So I work for the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve in partnership.
Which I was having trouble pronouncing earlier, but thank you very much.
In partnership with the Elkhorn Slough Foundation. We're at the cosmic center of the Monterey Bay, the cosmic center of the universe. And there are many opportunities for people to be involved, either in, like we say, hands-on restoration, or supporting those organizations through gifts, or come down and become a docent at the reserve and teach other people about these processes so that they know what's going on. That's all very important work.
Nadia, are there opportunities for folks to be engaged in your work and the things you're doing?
Yeah, more opportunity probably on the public land side and you know, getting your hands dirty. But the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County puts together volunteer efforts, and that's a good place to jump in and be able to see properties that they own that are available for public access, or and help keep them wild and natural.
Right. And Ken, folks that want to work shoulder to shoulder with you,
easily done.
All right.
www.wildwork.org.
Well, it's really been very enjoyable listening to all of you talk about the restoration, biodiversity, the invasive species, and all the things that as I was pointing out, are part of the things that we should be concerned about in our community, and particularly so when we're talking about the land that we live on and how we live on it and how we can restore it and do those kinds of things. Any last thoughts by anyone? A few seconds.
Re-indigenation.
Re-indigenation.
Let's become part of this place again, folks.
Re-indigenation.
Yeah.
Take that with you.
We have not left the indigenous people behind. We did bad things at once. They're still with us, the indigenous people, and we need to become indigenous too, and this restoration work is part of it.
Well, thank you all. Ken, Nadia, Gray, thank you so much for being here. This has been fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. I found it extremely informative. Everyone at home, thanks to Charlie Phillips, who's our producer. Thanks to everybody behind the cameras here. And this is Steve Plach asking you to do whatever you can to support community TV. And thanks for watching Voices from the Village. Good night.